All right, here's level 3, part 2, and we want to start understanding what this unit circle will do for us. So, in each quadrant of the coordinate plane, certain sine, cosine, and tangent functions are positive and negative. So, if we can remember a little acronym, it's going to help you a lot here. So, let's talk about what's positive and negative. So, if you remember, before I even start this, we've got to remember that sine equals y over h. Cosine is going to equal x over h, and tangent is going to equal y over x. Okay, so let's talk about first quadrant here. So sine, if sine is the y coordinate, so if in the first quadrant the y's are all positive, h is always going to be positive no matter where it is. Excuse me. So h is positive, and if I have a positive divided by a positive, I know the outcome will be positive. So sine in the first quadrant is positive. With cosine, cosine is x over h, and the x coordinate in the first quadrant is always positive. Same thing with the h, always positive, so cosine is positive. And last but not least is tangent. Tangent is y, which is positive, and x, which is positive. So tangent is also positive. Okay, let's take a look in the second quadrant. In the second quadrant, y is still positive, but the x values are now negative. So a positive divided by a negative is a negative, which means sine is negative in the second quadrant. Cosine is x over h, and in the, I just screwed up sine. Hold on, go back. Okay, let's try that again. Sine is positive in the x coordinate, in the second quadrant. H is always positive, so sine is positive in the second quadrant. That's better. Okay. Cosine, the x coordinates are negative in the second quadrant, so cosine is negative over a positive h, which makes cosine negative in the second quadrant. Okay, and then tangent is y, which is positive, and x, which is negative in the second quadrant. So tangent, a positive divided by a negative, is a negative. So the only thing that's positive in quadrant 2 is sine. Okay, in the third quadrant we have sine, which is y over h, and y's in the third quadrant are negative. H is always positive, but a negative divided by a positive is a negative. For cosine is x over h. The x's are negative, the h's are always positive, but cosine is still going to be negative then. Now tangent is y over x, so y's are negative, x's are also negative, but a negative divided by a negative is a positive, which makes tangent positive in the third quadrant. Alright, last one is sine in the fourth quadrant. So sine is y over h, y's are negative, h's are positive, so sine is negative. Cosine, the x's are positive, the h's are positive, so cosine is positive. And then tangent is y over x, y's are negative, x's are positive, tangent's going to be negative. Okay, so here's how I remember these, where things are positive. In the first quadrant, everything is positive, so I label this as all. Okay, everything is positive in the first quadrant. In the second quadrant, only sine is positive, so I'm going to assign S to the word students. So I'm making a little acronym for you. In the third quadrant, only tangent is positive, so I'm going to say take. So T represents tangent. All students take. So everything's positive in the first quadrant, only sine is positive in the second, only tangent is positive in the third, and the last one, cosine, is calc. Okay, so calc, the C represents the cosine. So all students take calc will represent what's positive in each quadrant. Okay, so that will help you a lot as you're going through problems like we're just going to go through right here. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 of them for you, and then I want you to try 2 of them on your own. So it says cosine theta is greater than 0. That means if I have numbers greater than 0, those numbers are going to be positive. So this is saying cosine is positive. The second one is saying cotangent is greater than 0. Well, to make this a little bit more familiar to us, let's just say tangent of theta is greater than 0. Okay, because that's what I have written on my unit circle. So if tangent is greater than 0, that means tangent is also positive. Alright, so where is cosine positive? So look back up on your unit circle and find where cosine is positive. There should be two quadrants. Those quadrants should be in the first and the fourth. For the tangent is positive, that should be in the first and the third. So where these overlap, where these both are true, is the first quadrant. So your answer is the first quadrant. Okay, one more. So I have sine is greater than 0. That means sine is positive. Cotangent, again, I'm just going to write this as tangent just so it's a little bit more familiar to me. And now this is saying tangent is less than 0. So if I have less than 0, that means my numbers are negative. So I want to know where tangent is negative. So let's first talk about where sine is positive. So all students take calc. So all is the first one, and then the S is in the second quadrant for students. So sine is positive in the first and the second quadrant. Where tangent is negative, it's not negative in the first, but it's negative in the second, because only sine is negative. Sine is positive. It's not negative in the third, but it is negative in the fourth. So you want to know where they overlap, and they overlap in the second quadrant. So your answer is the second quadrant. Okay, try the next two, press pause, and then check your answer. Alright, so the answer for C is in the first quadrant, and the answer for D is in the second quadrant. Okay, back to the unit circle. You need to know what, on the axes, what sine, cosine, and tangent are. On the 0, the 360, and the 180, so basically on the x-axis, sine, cosine, and tangent. So sine is going to be 0, cosine is going to be 1, and tangent is going to be 0. On the other side of that, it's just going to flip. Sine is still 0, cosine is now -1, and tangent is 0. And we'll get into this more with the unit circle. Okay, on the 90 degree, sine is going to be 1, cosine is going to be 0, and then tangent's going to be undefined. So IOU is how I remember it. And then on the reverse of that, it's just going to be -1, 0, and undefined again. So that's sine, cosine, and tangent in that order. So you just have to remember those. Again, they go in a pattern. 0, 1, 0, IOU, 0, -1, 0, and negative IOU. And the I's I mean ones. Alright, so that's just something that you'll have to remember for the test. So here's why we need to know this. Is this going to help us a little bit? Again, I'm just going to do like 2 of them, and then I'm going to have you check them on, do the next 4 and check them on your own. So now I'm going to be giving you an angle, and I want you to determine, before you even start, if cosine is positive or negative. So if I draw this on the coordinate plane, the angle of 135 is going to be in the second quadrant because it's between 90 and 180. Okay, so so I know I'm in the second quadrant. So is cosine positive or negative in the second quadrant? And since it's all students, sine is only positive in the second quadrant, so cosine will be negative. Okay, pretty simple. I'll do B for you, and then I'll have you do the next ones. So sine of -135, so again I'm going down because it's negative, and I'll land in the second quadrant, or in the third quadrant. So all students take calc. So the take means tangent is only positive, so that means sine in the third quadrant is going to be negative. Okay, go ahead and try the next 4. Alright, and there are your answers. I have one more thing for you on the first page. Alright, so here's again why it's important for us to know what quadrant we're in, because we're going to be given problems like this and we want to find a couple trig functions. So A just says find the sine and tangent if cosine theta equals 2/3 and cosine of tangent is greater than 0. So we're not finding all 6 trig functions, but we're just given a little bit of information to find just 2 of them. Okay, so I'm just going to do one example, and again I'll do the rest of them for you to check your work. So the first thing that I want to look at is cosine and cotangent. So cosine of theta says it's 2/3, which means cosine is positive. And that only happens in the first and the fourth quadrant. And then cotangent, which is just tangent, is also positive, and that only happens in the first and the third. So in order to locate where this triangle is, I needed to figure out where these were positive and negative. And again, where they overlap is in the first quadrant. So I know this triangle is going to be in the first quadrant. Alright, so now I have my triangle always drawn to the x-axis, and cosine I know is x over h. So here's 2 and 3. And then I would do the Pythagorean theorem to find out the rest. And this is going to be the square root of 5. Okay, so now I'm just going to find sine of that angle. So sine of theta is y over h. So the square root of 5 over 3. And then tangent is x over h. So, y over x. So root 5 over 2. Alright, so there's one example. So go ahead and try the next 3 if you want to. Otherwise, go straight to your practice. Actually, no, wait. Go back to the very beginning.